dear learners, welcome to the teaching learning session of sociology. In the lecture series of sociology, in our last lecture, we discussed about the Dalit movement. In this lecture, we will discuss about the feminist movement. The role and the status of men and women and other gender issues have given rise to gender-based movement. The dictionary meaning of gender is classification of objects roughly corresponding to the two sexes as well as the properties of these two sexes. While discussing the difference between the sexes, we generally focus on biological and reproductive functions. But difference in gender relates to various other attributes which may be socially and culturally determined. Sex is biological, whereas gender is sociological. This is the difference between the sex and gender. Sex is biological, while gender is sociological. The social meaning we attribute to it. The role tells us about what is expected from an individual in a particular situation, while status deals with an individual's expectations arising out of that situation. A role is what is expected from the individual, while status is what an individual expects out of that situation. A role deals with the duties, obligations, while status deals with the rights. Let us take an example. A woman is a mother, a wife, a cook, a teacher of her children, a daughter-in-law, and so on. What if that mother is a principal of a college? She has to deal with a range of roles and status, but with the tensions that may arise out of her roles as a mother or her role as an administrator. So she has to play many roles and she has to deal with the tensions, with the duties, and with the obligations associated with the different roles. We all have seen the caste and religious conflicts and wondered how these conflict arises. In many cases, they occur because of differences in expectations. We have heard how a certain caste or community oppresses or ill-treat members of other castes or communities. This caste oppression is a recognized expression of power and control of one group over another. It is quite confusing by the manner in which the term like keeping people in their place, honor, conflict, power have been used. It is very important to understand how the various roles and expectations of social groups have compete with another. We will discuss about the women's movement in India. N. Desai, in her work From Accommodation to Articulation, Women's Movement in India, critically examine the disturbing aspects of social situations in India, which in fact is the slow erosion of concerns for women's, for issues of women's even after independence. According to her, in the decades preceding to the attainment of national independence, prior to 1947, there was an outstanding record of women's participation in political struggle. And through it, out of articulating their rights, they were articulating their rights even before independence. They participated in various political struggles. But until the early 70s, there has been no concern, action about the achievement of the goals of equality. Independence generated a great deal of hopes and optimism in people. The early 50s saw the enactment of several legislations which established formal equality, removed social disabilities, setting up various administrative bodies for the creation of opportunities for women, and inducing a number of feminists into government. Another important factor which affected the counters of women's movement was the emergence of new welfare society in 1953. The government established a central social welfare board in which many of the prominent women social workers were associated with it. Several voluntary organizations and women's associations began to rely on the grants received from the board. As a result, they lost their spirit and vigor of the pre-independence phase. Thus, no efforts was made to increase the earning power of women. Women's development was thought to be confined to the education, social welfare, and health by the planning commissions. Besides, in every plan, the proportionate allocation for social service was declined, while which was subjected to heavy cuts in the times of crisis. The order of priorities up to the fourth plan has been education, then health, and social welfare, because it was generally assumed that all other programs will benefit women directly or indirectly. A movement that started in 1970s was different from the predecessors, for which it grew out of number of radical movements of the time. The most interesting movement for feminists were the Shahada and the anti-price rise agitation in Maharashtra, and the self-employed women's association, that is Seva and Nav Nirman in Gujarat. The Shahada movement in Dhulai district of Maharashtra was started by Bhil tribal landless landowners. Drought and famine in Maharashtra during this period increased the poverty already created by the invidious rate of sharecropping, land alienation, and money lending charges. And these conditions contributed to the rising militancy among Bhils. Drought, famine, poverty, sharecropping, land alienation, and money lending contributed to the militancy among Bhils, and this has given rise to the Shahada movement in Dhulai district of Maharashtra. The Shahada movement began as a folk protest in late 1960s. It took on more militant campaigning thrust when a new left joined the movement in early 1970s and helped the Bhils to form an organization, the Shramik Sangatana, in 1972. So basically, it was started as a folk protest in late 1960s, but this campaign get thrust when the new left joined the movement in 1970s, and they formed a Shramik Sangatana in 1972. Shahada movement women were more active than men, and that as their militancy grew, they began to take direct actions on issues specific to them as women, such as physical violence associated with alcoholism. Group of women began to go from village to village to stop liquor dens and destroy liquor pots. Women would assemble, beat them, and force them to apologize to his wife in public. In Gujarat, what was probably the first attempt at forming a women's trade union was made in Ahmedabad by Gandhian socialists attached to the Textile Labor Association. It is formed in 1972 at the initiative of Ella Bhatt, who worked in women's wing of TLA, that is Textile Labor Association. Self-employed Women's Association Seva was an organization of women who worked in different trades in informal sectors but shared a common experience of extremely low earnings, very poor working conditions. Most of them performed piecework in their homes or toiled on the street as a vendor or hawkers. Harassment from their authorities and lack of recognition of their work as a socially useful labor. Conditions of drought and famine and earlier in the rural area of Maharashtra in early 1970 led to sharp rise in prices in urban areas. In 1973, Mrinal Bore, the Socialist Party, and Ahilya Rangekar, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, that is CPIM, together with many others, formed the United Women's Enterprise Rise Front. So, in 1973, Women Enterprise Rise Front has been created, right? To mobilize women of the city against inflation. The aim of this uh, front was to mobilize the women of the city against the price rise or the inflation. They campaigned rapidly, and this campaign became a mass movement for consumers, for the protection of the consumers, and its members demanded that the government fix prices and distribute essential commodities. Soon after the movement, it spread to the Gujarat, where it was known as Nav Nirman movement in 1974. Nav Nirman, originally a students' movement against price rising, corruption, and black marketing. It became a massive middle class movement joined by thousands of women. It took the police some 3 months to subdue the Nav Nirmana movement, and between 90 and 100 people were killed during this movement. In the same year as the Nav Nirmana movement developed and was subdued, the first women's group associated with the contemporary feminist movement was formed in Hyderabad, comprising women from the Maoist movement, the Progressive Organization of Women, that is POW, exemplified rethinking within the left. As the Shahada movement, Maoist women stressed their existence of gender oppression and to organize women against it. In the year 1975, we saw a sudden development of a whole spate of feminist activities in Maharashtra. Influenced by POW, most women in Pune formed Purogami Stree Sangathan, that is Progressive Women's Organization. And most women in Bombay formed a Stree Mukti Sangatana, that is Women's Liberation Organization. On March 8th, International Women's Day was celebrated in India for first time by both party-based and autonomous organization in Maharashtra. Lal Nishan, that is the red flag party, celebrated it with a special issue of the party paper. In August, the Marathi socialist magazine Sadhana brought out a special women's issue. Now, this is the beginning. In September, Dalits and socialists organized a conference of Devdasis, that is literally servants of God or temple prostitutes. And in October, a number of organizations that had developed out of moist movements such as Lal Nishan Party and Shramik Sangatana organized a United Women's Liberation Struggle conference in Pune. In late 19th century, under the leadership of Jyotiba Phule, Dalit had also asked for the rights to education, especially the women's education. They raised their voice against Parda and widows' remarriage. Jan Vedana, a Dalit Marathi newspaper, brought out special women's issues entitled in the Third World Women Hold Up Half the Sky. a slogan borrowed from the Chinese Revolution to make clear its departure from the first world feminism. Women from the Dalit movement formed an intriguing new group called Mahila Samta Sainik Dal. The declaration of state emergency in 1975 by the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi interrupted the development of the women's movement. Many political organizations were driven underground during this emergency period. Thousands of activists were arrested, and most who remained at liberty focused on the civil rights such as freedom of speech and associations, the right to protest, and the right to the political prisoners. The lifting of emergency in 1977 and the formation of Janta government in 1978 led to a renewal of some of the earlier movements. Women's groups were formed all over the country, but mainly in the major cities. The distinguishing feature of the new women's groups were that they declared themselves to be feminist, despite the fact that most of their members were drawn from the left, which saw feminism as bourgeois, that is, belonging to a middle gender based movement and upper middle class and divisive. They insisted on being autonomous, even though most of their members were affiliated to other political groups, generally of far left, and they rapidly built networks among one another, ideological differences notwithstanding. All the three features were, however, defined in a certain way, limited by the history of these groups, whose first year was spent mainly in attempts at self definition. The fact that most of the members were drawn from the far left and belonged to the urban educated middle class influenced the feminist movement of the late 1970s and early 1980s in a complex and varied ways. The only party based women's organization to be formed in late 1970 was Mahila Dakshata Samiti, Women's Self Development Organization, which was founded in 1977 by a socialist woman and coalition of Janata Party. Some feminists were critical to party practices but believed that the parties could enact valuable reforms and fulfill feminist aim. Others were critical to the party political parties' participations, and yet others argued that political parties, even of the left, were so centralized that they would never fulfill the feminist goals. The feminist campaign in late 1970s and early 1980s were dominated by a new city-based groups. A similar group of feminists consciousness had taken place in certain rural movements. In 1950s, sharecroppers movement in Telangana area of Andhra Pradesh was again renewed in late 1970s. So in Andhra Pradesh, sharecropper movement, which was started in 1950, was renewed in late 1970s, and the area was declared as a disturbed zone by the government. In Telangana's Karimnagar district, where women had been specially active in landless laborers movement from the 1960s, on the new wave of agitation began with a campaign against kidnapping of a woman called Devama and murder of her husband by a local landlord. So these were the some situations which have given rise to various feminist movements. According to Stree Shakti Sangatana, which was founded in late 1970s in Hyderabad, the demand for independent women's organization came from the women themselves, who raised the issues of wife beating and landlord rape through the Mahila Sanghams. Now they have started raising their voice to form organization for their rights. They have started asking for their rights. At around the same time, in Bodh Gaya, district of Bihar, feminist issues were raised by a women in socialist students organization, the Chhatra Yuva Sangharsh Vahini, that is the Young Students Struggle Organization, which was involved in agricultural laborers movement for the land reclamation from the temple priest who owned most of the lands in the areas. So, in the various parts of India, these movements started in one way or another. Even the political parties, the women, and the students were involved in various movements during this period. As the Shahada and Telangana movement, women were critical and very active in this struggle. And in 1979, a women's camp in Bodh Gaya decided that Vahini campaigns to reclaim plots of the land, and they would demand that plots to be registered in the names of men and women. The first campaign of the contemporary Indian feminist movement were against dowry and rape. This was the first campaign of the contemporary India. It is the first feminist movement, and this movement was against the dowry and the rape. And this protest against dowry were first organized by the Progressive Organization of Women (POW) in Hyderabad in 1975. Although some of the demonstrations numbered as many as 2,000 people, the protest did not grow into a full-fledged campaign because of imposition of emergency, which drove most of the activities, most of the activists underground. After the lifting of emergency, a new movement against dowry started in Delhi. This time it was against violence upon women for dowry, especially against murder and abetment to suicide. The Mahila Dakshata Samiti was first women's organization in Delhi. It was the first Delhi's contemporary feminist movement to take up the issues of dowry and dowry harassment. It was Sri Sangharsh, a fledgling feminist group founded in 1979 that drew public attention to dowry related crimes. On 1st June 1979, drew a public organized demonstration against the death of Tarvinder Kaur, a young woman of Delhi who had left a deathbed statement saying that the in-laws had killed her because of her parents could not fulfill the in-laws' ever increasing demands for the dowry. This demonstration was widely reported by the national press, and in the next few weeks, there was a spate of demonstrations against the dowry death. One of the biggest ones, led by Nari Raksha Samiti, the Women's Rescue Committee on 12th June, through the alleys of Old Delhi. Feminists recorded the last word of the dying women, took family testimony, and encouraged friends and neighbors to come forward with their evidence. As a result, many families began to lodge complaints with the police against the harassment of their daughters by the in-laws for more dowry. Campaign against dowry death gradually began to be taken up by neighborhood groups, teachers' associations, and trade unions. Now, this movement has become the social movement because this campaign was gradually taken up by the neighborhoods, by the teachers' associations, by the trade union, that is, by all the class and the castes of the society. In 1980, a year after anti dowry agitation began, the government passed a law against dowry related crimes that recognized abetment to suicide because of dowry demands as a special crime and made mandatory to police to investigate into the death of any women within the 5 years of marriage. So this was the result of those protests that in 1980 and government passed a law against dowry related crimes. And through the law, though the law was passed in 1980, the first positive judgment under it didn't occur until 1982 when a Delhi Session Court magistrate found two people guilty of dowry murder and sentenced them to death. The judgment was reversed by Delhi High Court in early 1983. Women's group from the party affiliated left and autonomous groups protested and were held for contempt of court. In 1985, the Supreme Court upheld the verdict but converted the sentence to life imprisonment. Moreover, the storm that women's group raised in 1983 had some indirect effects. So, because of that law which was presented or which was enacted by the government in 1980, in 1982, the first judgment came in which the two people were found guilty under that law and courts sentenced them to the death. But in 1983, the High Court reversed the order. Women's group protested against this, and in Supreme Court upheld the verdict, but that converted this sentence to the life imprisonment. So this verdict has indirectly affect many movements, feminist movements. In December 1983, the Criminal Law, the Second Amendment Act was passed. The first was in 1980. In 1983, the Criminal Law, the Second Amendment Act was passed, which made cruelty to a wife a cognizable, non-bailable offense, and it is punishable up to 3 years imprisonment and fine too. The Act also redefined cruelty to include mental as well as physical harassment. So, mental harassment even is punishable act. It is a punishable act. In addition, Section 113A of the Evidence Act was amended so that the court could draw an inference of abetment to suicide. Finally, the Act amended Section 174 of the Criminal Procedure Code, requiring a post-mortem examination of the body of a woman who died within 7 years of marriage. From 5 years, now it became to the 7 years, and the post-mortem is compulsory. It is required to post-mortem or examine the body of a woman who died within a 7 years of his marriage. Then there was an agitation against rape. Few months after the campaign against dowry-related crimes, began the agitation against rape. It started with campaign against police rape. When the new feminist group were formed in late 1970s, they were already familiar with the categories of police and landlord rape for both, especially the former had been addressed by the Maoist movements. The issue of police rape achieved a new significance in 1978, just as feminist groups were in the process of formation through an incident in Hyderabad. A popular uprising ensued. 22,000 people went to set up roadblocks, cut the telephone wires, stoned the building, and set fire to some bicycles in the compound. The army had to be called in, and the uprising was quieted only after the state government had been dismissed and commission of inquiry into a rape and a murder has been appointed. Even the state government had been disappointed in this case. In 1979, there were women's demonstrations against the incidents of police and landlord employer rapes in many parts of the country. Campaign against these incidents, however, remained isolated from each other until 1980s, when an open letter by four senior lawyers against the judgment in case of police rape in Maharashtra sparked off a campaign by feminist group and known as Mathura rape case. The campaign against rape began in 1978-79, marked a new stage in development of feminism in India. The Bombay feminist group Forum Against Rape, that is FAR, which is now called as Forum Against the Oppression of Women, decided in February 1980 to campaign for the reopening of the case and wrote to feminist groups across the country to protest and to propose that demonstrations to be held on International Women's Day, that is on 8th of March, to demand a retrial. In effect, this was the first time that feminist group coordinated a national campaign. Groups in 7 cities responded to FAR letter and organized demonstrations on 8th March demanding a retrial of Mathura case. The implementation of relevant sections of Indian Penal Code and charges in the rape case. In both Bombay and Delhi, joint committees were formed of feminist group and socialist and communist parties affiliates to coordinate the campaign. Protests against police rape were reported from all over the country, only some of which were organized by feminists. As in agitation against the dowry, the first protest against the police rape sparked off a series of protests by neighborhood, trade union based groups, and in the different parts of the country. Within the month of agitation, the government introduced a bill defining the categories of custodial rapes and specifying a mandatory punishment of 10 years imprisonment in camera trial and shift of onus of proof onto the accused. There was a growth and maturing of the movement. The mixed experience of the campaigns against rape and dowry led many feminists to question their methods and techniques. The discovery that there was a little and a faulty connection between the enactment and the implementation of the laws left many feelings betrayed and bitter. According to them, the government had easily sidetracked their demands by enacting legislations. This gave rise to further questions about the efficacy of basing campaigns and around the demands for changes in laws and by extensions around the demands for actions from the states. In early 1980s, the women's centers were formed in several cities to provide women with legal aid, counseling, healthcare, and employment. Attempt to appropriate symbol of women's power grew in 1980s through reinterpreting myths, epic, and folk tales, and unearthing historical forms of women's resistance in India. The emphasis gradually changed to the looking for traditional sources of women's strength rather than simply sufferings. The search for historical example of women's resistance led feminists to scrutinize the distant and immediate past to look at role of women played in the broader movement for social transformation and to reclaim some of the movements predicting contemporary feminism. One example of this is Chipko movement against deforestation in northern India. It began in 1917. Chipko means cling to was the movement to prevent forest destruction by the timber contractors and was carried forward largely by women who were traditionally responsible for fuel, food, and water in family. By early 1980s, feminism has branched into series of activities ranging from the production of literature, audiovisual material, to slum improvement work, employment generation, health education, and trade unions. The first professions to feel the influence of feminism were journalism, academia, and medicine. Soon after feminist movement began, most of major English language dailies had deputed one or more women journalists to write exclusively on feminist issues, and the network of women journalists evolved. Women's studies took off in 1980s, initially under the aegis of independent research institutions such as the Center for Women's Development Studies, that is CWDS, in Delhi. Though an attempt to fund research at university level was made by SN Damodar Thackeray, that is SNDT, Women's University in Bombay, which set up Women's Research Unit. The SNDT CWDS began to jointly host annual National Women's Studies Conference, and interest in women's studies grew so rapidly that today the University Grant Commission, a central government body, plans to set up women's study courses at college level. The early 1980s witnessed a series of counter movement against feminist ideas by section of traditionalist society. The rise of these counter movements was partly related to spread of feminism and the influence it was beginning to have women's attitudes, especially within family. The kind of support that women's centers gave women who were being harassed for dowry or forced into arranged marriage, say provoked a considerable degree of public and private hostility, and the feminists began to face attacks from the families in person and through the police and the courts too. The earlier attacks would have led to wave of sympathy for the feminists. From the mid 1980s on, they were accompanied by public and increasingly sophisticated critique of feminism. Much of this criticism took place in context of growing communalism. So in 1980s, the counter movement against the feminist idea took place. The activists faced many types of challenges from their families, from the police, from the society, and even from the court. and this has increased because of growing communalism. LGBT and Q movement is one of the very important feminist movement. There has been different sexualities besides males and females, and traditional ambiguity and vagueness about them. LGBT is the code word which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgenders. This community has originally been known as gay community, but it is not enough to use this term since it referred only to men. Hence, the term LGBT was introduced in mid 1980s. These people have different sexual orientation than the normal person. Their orientations regarding sexual life, self identification, sexual behavior is different. The LGBT and well faces innumerable difficulties in the society where the only gender based movement accepted orientation is heterosexuality. Homosexuality is regarded as abnormal. Abuse is their daily routine and they faced it almost every day. Members of this LGBT and Q society are more likely to experience intolerance, discrimination, harassment, and the threats of violence due to their sexual orientation than those that identify themselves as heterosexual. They face inequalities and violence at every place around the world. They face torture from the people who mock at them and make them realize that they are different from others. In many countries, the rights enjoyed by opposite sex couples are not enjoyed by the same sex couples. They are prohibited from those rights. As a result, they face discrimination and cannot enjoy a social protection scheme such as healthcare. The LGBT people even hide their gender and do not disclose it due to fear of losing their job. The young LGBT people face ragging and harassment in schools, colleges, and universities, which in many cases leads to depression, school dropout, and homelessness. They gradually develop a low self esteem and low self confidence and become isolated from friends and family. The parents of the normal children do not allow them to mix with LGBT children, acting completely out of care and concern without realizing that this leads to isolation for the other one. Lack of communication between LGBT child and the parents often leads to the conflict in the family. Many LGBT youth are placed in foster care or end up in juvenile detention or onto a street because of family conflict related to their LGBT identity. LGBT teens have to face a very high risk of health and mental problems when they become adults because they are rejected by their parents and society at large. According to a study, around 30% of LGBT in the US has been abused by the members of their family for their different sexual orientation. Also, a survey revealed that 40% of the homelessness people constituted of LGBT. Studies done by a gay, lesbian, and a straight education network reported that nearly 9 out of 10 LGBT students faces harassment. The 2007 National School Climate Survey found not only that LGBT students were harassed, but 31.7% of LGBT students missed a class and 32.7% missed a day of school because of feeling unsafe. In some countries, homosexuality is regarded as a crime. It is illegal and is often met by the imprisonments and fines. The first bold step was taken by USSR when it decriminalized the homosexuality in around 1920s. It was at that time when society was very conservative and was also socially backward regarding the matter of sexuality. But this victory was short-lived, as during the rule of Stalin, homosexuality was recriminalized again. Immediately after World War II, a lot of homosexual groups came to the forefront and emphasized love over sex. The movement called Homophile Movement was started in Europe in 1945 and continued up to around 1970. A new movement called the Gay Liberation Movement started in 1970 and continued for the 4 years. Homosexual groups like Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activist Alliance were formed. Bisexual started gaining prominence in LGBT movement in 1970s. National Bisexual Liberation Group was formed in New York, representing the bisexuals. They advocate for the lesbian and gay rights. Homosexuality was considered as an illness around the world. But in 1979, Sweden became the first country in the world to remove homosexuality as illness. In modern India, Shakuntala Devi was the first to publish the study of homosexuality in 1977. Section 377 of Indian Penal Code talks about the unnatural offences, stating homosexuality is illegal in India. The movement to repeal 377 section was initiated by AIDS भेदभाव विरोधी आंदोलन in 90 and भेदभाव विरोधी आंदोलन in 1991. They published an article regarding section 377 and wanted to eliminate that. In 2001, it again gained a moment when a public interest litigation was filed by the Naz Foundation in Delhi in High Court. For the first time in the history of India, the third gender was given recognition and was officially recognized as another gender. The Honorable Supreme Court of India, in case of National Legal Service Authority versus Union of India, in its landmark judgment in 2013, created a third gender status. The government of India had been directed by the Supreme Court for treating the members of the third genders as a social and economically backward. On February 2016, the criminalization of homosexual activity was reviewed by the Supreme Court. In August 2017, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the right to privacy is inherent and a fundamental right under Article 21 in the Indian Constitution, providing hopes to LGBT activities. That the court would soon strike down Section 377. The court also ruled that the person's sexual orientation is a matter of privacy issue. In January 2018, the Supreme Court agreed to refer the question of validity of 300 and of Section 377 to a large bench of examination before October 2018. On 6 September 2018, the Supreme Court of India decriminalized the homosexuality by declaring Section 377 of Indian Penal Code non-constitutional. That's all for today. Thank you very much. Namaskar.